My name is public, yet, at the same time, private. I'm a Catholic priest living in the United States. You can call me Father Gray or Padre Gray. It was an old moniker among my close friends at the seminary. Since I was sprouting silver locks on my scalp at 22, the name didn't disseminate beyond that group, however. So it seems safe enough to use. If you do recognize it, though, please keep things quiet. It's not that I fear any reprisal for giving out my actual name. It's just generally frowned upon. You see, I'm the chief exorcist for my rather large diocese, and the names of exorcists are generally kept secret. Now, Padre, you may be thinking, surely that's a bit much. I can understand folk in the past blaming every bump in the night or psychiatric episode on ghosts and demons. But a man in the 21st century, in the current year, yes, my friend, in the current year, not every bump in the night. Of course, carbon monoxide, settling houses, and even infrasound phenomenon can explain quite a lot. Not every psychiatric episode, either. I suppose much of this is common cultural knowledge at this point, since everyone loves a good ghost story. But the process of procuring a visit from me is stringent to say the least. Psychological evaluations, physician visits. We even let skeptics tag along for objectivity, admittedly. The pool of these narrows year by year. I have personally received about a dozen into the church following their experiences with me. The days of the local parish priest in the Middle Ages doubling as an exorcist are long gone. In part due to their zeal in diagnosing random ailments as demonic activity, the church, at least as an entity, takes this seriously. So do I. I suppose that's partly why I'm writing this. Admittedly, I was also inspired by the recent amma from a well-known bishop. Call it a convergence of influences leading me to recount my own stories, which to this point have only been shared with my spiritual director. So, where to begin? Perhaps my first time. I was fresh out of the seminary in the spring of 2008. Newly ordained and arriving at my first parish assignment. The smell of chrism was still fresh on my hands, not even a day after arriving at St. Matthew, a bourgeois suburban parish which I was preparing to rough out for a year or two. I received a call from the vicar for clergy. For those unaware of how church structure works, this is someone who works directly under the bishop to organize and keep tabs on all the priests in his diocese. His role is mostly figuring out which parishes to send clergy to. So my assumption was that he wanted to check in on my arrival. I clicked the answer button on my brick phone. Monsignor Phillips, I exclaimed. A pleasure to hear from you, Gray. He jovially replied. Hope you're settling in at St. Matthew's well. How is Father David? Father David was the pastor of St. Matthew's, being a baby priest, as the newly ordained are called. I was only slated to be assigned as a parochial vicar for a few years until I had some experience under my belt. He's well enough, keeping busy. I'm looking forward to getting to know the place better. Well. About that, he paused, and in his characteristic Joker style he drew out the bombshell. St. Matthew's may be a bustling soccer mom parish. His sarcasm was biting, but they're not in any need of a second priest. I confusedly replied. So, am I taking up some other ministry while I'm living here? Nope, he flatly replied. I don't quite get what you mean then, Gray. His voice had suddenly developed a cold command. Bishop Joseph has been keeping some tabs on you the past few years. He's been impressed with your academics, but above all your spiritual development. Just between us, the seminary described you as their most mature graduate in some years. I was taken aback. Spiritually mature. The idea seemed ludicrous. Sure, I had developed a solid schedule of praying my office, being at daily mass, and engaging in personal prayer, but it seemed like the other men had been doing the same thing. As you know, Monsignor Phillips continued, interrupting my own thought process. The Holy See has been rather harshly coming down on the American church for its problems. You don't have to tell me twice, I thought to myself, to say nothing of the moral character of some of her clergy over the past decades. The Pope seems to have identified a more particular attitude of spiritual abandonment among the hierarchy here. Lack of piety, spiritual utilitarianism, modernism, the works. I knew very well the attitudes which he mentioned. One of the practices we've been almost universally lax in is maintaining a group of diocesan exorcists. I didn't like the direction this was headed. Not one bit. Gray. He paused again. You've been asked by the bishop to attend the Vatican's upcoming workshop on exorcisms, and to consider accepting the charge as an exorcist in this diocese. Do you accept? I felt a lump in my throat. Sure. One accepts the existence of the spiritual realm as a prerequisite for becoming a priest. But at the same time, did I really believe it? Or, rather, did I really believe I could handle it? Yet, With all these doubts swirling in my mind, the word came right out with almost no hesitation. Okay, good, Monsignor replied. Your address and technical assignment will remain at St. Matthew's to anonymize you. Mail will be forwarded to you in Rome. Swing by my office tomorrow morning and we'll get everything underway. Until then, take care. I pressed the end call button and sat down to think. Now, you might be thinking this is where the story picks up. I assure you, my time in Rome was less than eventful. I was there for a few months to attend classes and lectures, did a few practicums, heard some scary stories, was given a copy of the Rite of Exorcism, and sent back on a plane home, scheduled to begin a new assignment with the only exorcist in our diocese. I wondered what I had even been nervous about. Then I met Father Kelly. It was a cool autumn day when I arrived at St. Justin's, an old urban parish in a very large city with a reputation for being old school. The pastor had a reputation for being no nonsense, but a bit eclectic. He was lovingly referred to as Crazy Kelly out of earshot. Parking my car on the street and sticking a few coins in the meter, I suddenly became aware of how imposing the facade of St. Justin's was. Tall, neo-Gothic spires, dark stone and brickwork, stained glass probably as old as the city itself. The rectory situated to the left of the church itself was much the same. I only picked up my suitcase from the car, figuring I'd score some special parish parking later to unload the rest of my luggage. I walked through the gate and approached the decrepit-looking archtop door, raising my hand to knock. Suddenly, the door opened with a drawn-out squeal as the figure of Father Kelly filled the space. He was older, in his 80s at the time, a bit shorter than me, probably 5 feet 10, thin, slightly gaunt, but lively-looking. His hair, far beyond mine, was properly silver. He wore vintage-looking half-moon spectacles, and he was dressed in a priest's simplest and most characteristic attire. A black cassock. Gray, is it? He almost sounded excited, at least as much as a hoarse elderly voice could. What an absolute pleasure. He reached out his hand and grabbed mine, shaking the daylights out of me with a strength I wouldn't have expected from someone even half his age. Father Kelly, I said, cordially straightening up my posture and reciprocating the handshake. Very nice to meet you as well. Oh please, he jovially said, breaking the handshake and waving me in the door. I only make demons call me father. Drives him batshit, admittedly. I was taken off guard, but he continued walking through the foyer, waving me to continue through to a very cozy living room. A brick fireplace provided glowing light and warmth. Cushioned chairs and the smell of books abounded. Despite his erratic personality, it was clean as a whistle. We're gonna be living together, so we'd best get on a casual name basis. I'll call you Gray, if you like. You can call me Kelly, or just CK. He paused and glanced over his shoulder. Don't act like you don't know what it means. He smiled and sat down in an old chair, motioning for me to take the one opposite him. I sat down, placing my suitcase to my side. We exchanged some pleasantries, spoke about specifics regarding the parish, and then seemed to naturally gravitate to the topic at hand. So, I began, given what you said within a minute of meeting me. I take it you're the current exorcist. CK laughed, giving a small but dramatic bow of the head. At your service, kid. Been at it for 50-odd years now. Since around 1954. He paused and stared at the fire for a moment. Lots changed, lots stayed the same. He glanced at my suitcase. Got a ritual in there. I perked up. Yes, actually. They gave us one at the end of the program. I grabbed the suitcase, unbuckling it and handing him the book, red, hardcover, a golden papal seal embossed on the front. For a moment, I almost anticipated being able to give it some wear. CK curtly laughed. Aw Jesus. They're really making things hard on you guys. He tossed the book into the fireplace and it started to go up in flames. I jumped up, having a moment of panic as I wondered what sort of crazy Father Kelly actually was. But, I stuttered, unsure what to do. I worked for months to get that. CK had already stood up, walking to the nearby bookshelf. That ain't the ritual, kid. I took a moment to collect myself. What do you mean? I replied. CK turned to me with a raised eyebrow, still thumbing through the bookshelf. I mean that ain't the ritual. He continued his search. When it comes to our line of work, Gray, what works is what works. I'll take what's been handed down to us by tradition over something drawn up in a committee meeting in the 70 seconds. Aha! He pulled a small black book of the shelf, leather-bound and ancient-looking. On the cover, in simple but half-faded gold lettering, was one word, ritual. He handed the book to me and we sat back down. He kept silent, almost anticipating my desire to look through it. The Latin text, though slightly yellowed over time, was clearly discernible. The content was noticeably different, even to my amateur eye, from the book I had previously been given. We can wax philosophical about the nature of changing times later. CK curtly said, but suffice to say the book you had wasn't worth its weight in salt. This is the real deal. This is what works. I gave him a short nod. So, he said, almost giddily jumping up. Ready for your first assignment? I was almost shocked at his delivery. I just got here, and I'm not even familiar with this new book. Oh, no. Nothing like that, he almost assuringly replied. Just a sort of character assignment. Come into the office and I'll give you details. For the sake of brevity, I won't tell the entirety of our conversation. Perhaps for the sake of the person in question as well. CK had been apprised of a potential case by the bishop's office. Although the details were not entirely clear yet, no evaluations had been done, but something about the case. And he would not elaborate on what led to the bishop to ask CK to investigate it first. I'm a bit old for this investigating stuff, CK said with a laugh. Or, rather, I'm old enough that young blood should get the chance to shine. The assignment was simple. Visit an apartment in Chinatown, evaluate a 25-year-old male, and report my findings back to CK. Nothing too complicated, he assured me. Just visit, talk with the family, evaluate the patient, write down some observations, and come back here to see me. I'll keep the light on for you. And so, off I went. It was evening at this point, and the reflectiveness of the city's buildings made golden hour particularly beautiful. I almost doubted what my work was, even as I drove up to an otherwise normal apartment building and felt something hollow in my stomach. I parked my car on the curb, getting out and fumbling with putting my keys in the pocket on my own black cassock, worn now at CK's insistence. The uniform, he called it. Before I could even get to the door of the tall, brutalist apartment building, an Asian family had opened the door, congregating on the stoop and staring at me. Two men, similar looking enough to be brothers, two women, their wives, a handful of children and adults of varying ages. I slowed my walk a bit, taking in their expressions. They were dressed nicely, almost too nicely for home. The women had their makeup done. The men had combed their hair, but it was all a veneer. Underneath they looked exhausted, faces flushed, eyes red or glazed over, and their expressions, somewhere between hopeless and longing. I stood on the sidewalk in front of them. I'm Father Gray. I'm here to call on someone. The older-looking man just stared at me, opening and closing his mouth for a few moments. New, came the voice of one of the women, blue eyeshadow concealing dark bags around her eyes. We knew, in America, Catholic. She pulled a rosary from her pocket, smiling as she showed it to me. I smiled back and relied on body language to get me where I needed to be. I gestured myself through the door, and the men led me upstairs while the rest of the group remained on the stoop. After climbing a handful of stories, he paused, pulled out a key, and unlocked an apartment door. We walked inside. There were signs of life. Dinner on the table, a TV playing. It seemed, at least at the time, that they had somehow known of my arrival. The windows of the apartment faced a different street, though, so I couldn't make sense of the notion. They led me through the apartment, down a hallway to a door. I noticed the single feature marking it apart from the other doors, an exterior padlock. The older man went to unlock it, before being suddenly stopped by the younger. They spoke for a moment in their native language. Finally, the younger beckoned me. Benedicat, he said. Benedicat vos. Blessing. It seemed opportune, so I made the sign of the cross and imparted his request. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. The men signed themselves, and the older proceeded to unlock the door. They both backed away, and seemed to anticipate my entry with fear. I rotated the knob and pushed in the door. Immediately the air hit me. Hot, roasting hot, damp and dismal. And the smell, my God, the smell, like a rotting carcass, sickly sweet and pervasive, putting your body into a state of alarm. Ammonia stinging my nostrils. Were it not for higher faculties, I would have instinctively fled. The windows had been blacked out, and I could barely make out the form of a bed in the center of the room. I flipped the light switch. Before me was the immensity of human suffering, the likes of which I had never seen. On this bed was a man, or the form of a man, bound in chains and hardly discernible. His sweat-soaked skin, gray as stone, was marked with open sores, the sheets stained with blood, feces, and urine, and he was looking right at me. He just stared. It was like looking at a doll, or some other lifeless object, something so realistically human and, yet, not. An uncanny valley. It was terrifying, and in the depths of my soul I felt as if I needed to flee that place. My muscles seemed to burn with fear. My skin radiated chills up and down my entire body. and I stared into the face of something which every ounce of my unconscious mind warned me was only pretending to be human. I approached the bed. His eyes followed me, bloodshot and brown, but with an unusually piercing pupil. I stood next to him, every ounce of my willpower keeping me from running or retching. I'm not sure how long we did this, but I know that I didn't blink in the entirety of it. Finally, his cold and lifeless stare took on a life. His lips, deep purple and cracked, seemed to twitch. Was he speaking? Trying to speak? I held my silence to listen. I watched his face slowly contort into a wildly demented smile, chapped lips making small rips as the skin stretched. His teeth began to show, with the gum line so worn down as to not be visible. It was entirely unnatural. The entire time, neither of us blinked. Then, a whisper. "Gree." I blinked. A wicked, powerful cackling soared through his body. He was laughing at me, and it felt as if every dark deed of my life had been surfaced for the world to see. Every fear, every torment, every doubt. He cackled like some wild animal as my inmost being was laid bare. "Gray, Gray, Gray." He began shouting my name, screaming it. Beyond the voice itself were dozens of others, voices upon voices filled with hate and malice in the midst of their mockery. It was as if a chorus of fear were calling me by my basest instincts. "Gray, Gray, Gray." I turned and ran, the door of the room slamming behind me as every instinct in my mind suddenly kicked into gear. I ran down the steps, out the door, into my car. Even as I sat, fumbling again for my keys, I could hear this unholy chorus screaming in my ears. "Gray, Gray, Gray." Ignition, gear, gas, drive, drive, drive. I ran on instinct for miles, booking it back to St. Justin's. The sun had set, and in the darkness of the night I ran from my car to the door of the darkened rectory, slamming it shut behind me and heading straight for the kitchen while turning on every light I could. I'm not ashamed to say that I vomited. I was absolutely beside myself with fear, anxiety, and worry. I just needed some respite, a break. I slowly managed to walk to the living room, collapsing into the same chair I had sat in just a few hours before, and I just breathed, closed my eyes, and cried, and prayed, and wondered how in the hell I had been chosen for this position. And then I realized CK had not left the light on for me. My eyes shot open, taking in the faint light around me. Adrenaline pumped through my body. Where was Father Kelly? I paused for a moment, slowly standing up. Something was not right. I had turned the lights on, but something was off about them. I studied the room, the walls, the lamps. It was as if I was viewing them through sunglasses. They were shining, but so dimly, so softly. Suddenly, fear shot into my heart. A noise rang through my head, piercing my ears and making my chest and shoulders feel as if they would burst. An explosion, almost, or just a complete overwhelming of my auditory nerves. Whatever it was, it sent the animal part of my brain haywire. I felt as if I were in the sights of a predator, and there was no escape. I turned to face the door, suddenly making out the form of a massive, beastly shadow. More than a shadow, just the sheer absence of light itself, like looking into death and darkness in a being, in an animal. It approached. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It just came towards me with a beastly energy of indescribable hate and malice, casting itself up and lumbering over me. And all I could hear, all I could think, was the chorus of voices from that apartment. "Gray, Gray, Gray." I fell to the floor, screaming, "God, oh God, please." And in the deepness of my despair and fear, in his own small way, he seemed to answer. I heard the door of the rectory come flying open. Behind the shadow I could barely discern the figure of Father Kelly come into view, crucifix in hand and divine confidence making him appear almost youthful. In my last moments of consciousness I heard him, in a voice more commanding than any I had heard before. "Oh no, 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 no you do not. Not here. Not in my fucking house.